Hello, I'm Amanda Walker and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing America right now. In today's episode, the remaking of the 2024 race for the White House as President Biden succumbs to the inevitable.
Nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
Enter Kamala Harris, whose warp speed campaign has ignited the Democratic Party. She is now center stage, making her case to the nation.
I was an elected attorney general and an elected district attorney. And before that, I was a courtroom prosecutor. So in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women. Fraudsters who ripped off consumers. Cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
But how long will the Harris honeymoon last? Coming up, we hear from Democratic voters energized by the shakeup at the top of the ticket.
So now, wow, we've got this other person. She speaks well, she's intelligent, and I think she's inspiring a lot of people who weren't going to vote, the younger generation, that they'll step up and vote now.
And we'll talk to the election forecaster who has correctly predicted the result of almost every race for the past 40 years. Who's his money on in this new matchup?
My system is enduring. It's the North Star of election prediction because it taps into the fundamentals of how an election really works as votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party.
Well, never before has a sitting US president dropped out of the race so close to the election. It feels like we say it a lot these days, but this is a major moment in history. Can the Democrats turn what is essentially a crisis into an opportunity? Right now, the Democrats have some definite swagger, which could certainly be felt at Ben's Chili Bowl. Its high-profile patrons have made it a Washington, D.C. institution. We dropped in during the lunchtime rush to find out more about why Democrats feel so energized.
Oh, you're local.
Yes, ma'am.
Welcome to Ben's. We're happy to have you.
Since 1958, Virginia Ali has been welcoming everyone with equal grace into her small diner with the big reputation.
Where are you from?
Martinsburg, West Virginia.
Her motto is treat everyone as you wish to be treated, whether you're a tourist from overseas
Where are you from?
Portugal.
Portugal. I love Portugal.
or the President of the United States.
The first,
recognize him,
his very first visit here.
So what's it like when a president steps foot in your
Well, everybody just like,
Her esteemed guests go way back. Martin Luther King Jr.'s menu go-to was a chili cheeseburger. And while past patrons were not able to break through the glass ceiling, there's strong hope here that the first female president could be placing her order in the not-too-distant future.
my guests were coming in here very excited about it. Did you hear the news? Did you hear the news?
Really?
Yeah, people felt very energized about that.
Can Kamala Harris beat Donald Trump?
Yes. If people get out and vote like they're supposed to.
What do you think Donald Trump's going to do? What's he going to change to tackle Harris as a candidate?
I think he has to change his entire program now because he was originally going after Joe because of his age. He's got to recycle everything at this point, going after a younger person, a woman as well, mixed race as well.
Yep.
So there's a whole different thing I think he's got to change, but I don't think it's going to work. I hope it doesn't work.
I think she's inspiring a whole new generation of people who weren't too sure about whether they were going to vote because they weren't happy with either one. So now, wow, we've got this other person. She speaks well, she's intelligent, And I think she's inspiring a lot of people who weren't going to vote, the younger generation, that they'll step up and vote now.
I feel a lot more confident that people will step forward. People that were on the borderline now have a reason to step forward.
So you think more people are going to vote?
I hope so. I really do.
That's always going to be the question, though, you know.
Because I don't think we can do Trump no more. No. And the women have to be the forefront to push her right over the top. Yes. Because we have so much at stake, and we can't afford to lose this one.
Is America ready for a black female president?
Yeah. It's not gonna be easy, but we can do it.
The Harris campaign has started hot, but the appetite for something new has to last through to November.
So there's real enthusiasm there at Ben's Chili Bowl for Kamala Harris, but not everyone is sold. Some Democrats see Harris as a candidate who failed to get her bid for the 2020 Democratic nomination off the ground and who's been an unmemorable vice president marred by low approval ratings. So, can she do it? Historians are usually known for their views on the past, but Alan Lichtman is particularly good at predicting the future. He's successfully called pretty much every US election since 1984. So, what does he see in the Trump-Harris matchup? I started by asking him if the decision to replace Biden was the right one.
I didn't think so. I thought it was shameful for the Democrats to publicly trash their incumbent president, who was nominated not by Adam Schiff or Jamie Raskin or any member of Congress, but by the voters. But it turns out to be probably the right move ultimately, or at least a move that doesn't diminish Democrats' chances. I have my prediction system, the 13 keys to the White House.
Yeah, please outline that for us, because our viewers, if they're not familiar with it, tell us how it works.
Yes, my system is unique. It has been correct since I predicted Ronald Reagan's re-election in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time. The keys gauge the strength and performance of the White House party. And the way it works, if 6 of these strength and performance measures go against the White House party, they're predicted losers. Otherwise, they're predicted winners. They united behind Harris, which avoids the loss of the contest key. That means I only lost 1 key on my system, which does not create a situation where they're likely to lose. Moreover, it turns out that the Harris candidacy may have a positive effect for Democrats on 2 other keys. I think it diminishes the appeal of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I have a third-party key because people don't have to worry about choosing between 2 aged candidates. Kind of bothers me because I'm 77, but I understand it. And it makes it, I think, unlikely that social unrest is going to emerge because Biden, the incumbent, is not so front and center. So ultimately, I think it turned out to be a good move for Democrats, even though they went about it in a shameful way.
Okay, so your preliminary prediction is?
I have said a lot would have to go wrong for the Democrats to lose. It could happen, but it's not likely. Here's why. Under the Harris candidacy, the Democrats, the party holding the White House, are down 3 keys. Remember, 6 and you're out. The incumbency key, of course, the mandate key based on U.S. House losses, and the incumbent charisma key because Harris is not an FDR. That means 3 more keys would have to fall to predict their defeat. And there are only 4 shaky keys, and 2 of them actually lean Democratic. RFK Jr. is fading, and I think will continue to fade. And it's unlikely, although possible, the Democrats will lose the third-party key. And we've seen sporadic social unrest, but it's possible, but not likely, we'll see massive social unrest later this year, like we saw in 1968. So those are 2 undecided keys that lean Democratic. The only other 2 keys that are undecided are foreign military/failure and foreign military/success. So assuming the Democrats lose both of those, and it's by no means certain, one of the two keys that lean in their direction would have to reverse. That's why I'm saying it's possible, but not likely that the Democrats will lose. A lot would have to go wrong for the Democrats to lose. I will make my final prediction, though, in a few weeks.
So a lot of people talking about this being a honeymoon period for Kamala Harris, but it seems from what you're saying that you think this very strong start is sustainable.
That's right. I don't look at the ephemeral polls. You know, as we saw, polls are snapshots. They keep shifting and changing, and polls 3.5 months out from an election have no predictive value anyway. But you're right. My system is enduring. It's the North Star of election prediction because it taps into the fundamentals of how an election really works as votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. And the keys don't shift and change week to week or even rarely month to month. If you want me to step outside the keys, I'll tell you this. Trump had a tremendous opportunity after the attempted assassination to really become a broadly appealing, unifying candidate. And that really turned on the Republican convention. And they blew it. And they blew it big time. You know, it was the same old divisive, sinister, inflammatory rhetoric, the same old grievances, the same old lies. Trump did well for about 25 minutes. And then for an hour plus, it was the old Trump all over again, delivering more than 20 lies, expressing his grievances, dividing rather than uniting the country. It was a really blown opportunity for Trump. And then he made it worse at the recent convention of black journalists by claiming that somehow Harris only turned black in recent years, as if he, as a white guy, has a right to define the ethnic and racial identity of Kamala Harris, who, by the way, went to one of the most prestigious historically black universities, Howard University, who pledged at a black sorority, who was a member of the Black Caucus while in the Senate. So not only was it, you know, bordering on old racism when white people defined who was black and who wasn't, but it was an outright lie. Blowing it again. He was a chance to really reach out to the black electorate, and he blew it.
And just finally, Professor, do you predict more of the same of that kind of rhetoric from Donald Trump? We always talk about whether Trump will see that there is a different path that may be more effective for him if he becomes more moderate in his tone. It hasn't happened yet. Are you going to see it happen between now and November, do you think?
We've been watching Trump for, nearly 10 years, since 2015, even before that, when he issued the biggest, most protracted, most inflammatory lie in American political history, that our first black president really wasn't legitimate because he was born in Africa, despite all the evidence that he was born in Hawaii. If you think after 10 years or more, Trump is going to change, I have a big bridge in my hometown of Brooklyn that I'd be happy to sell you.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. Historian Alan Lichtman there offering his take that Harris currently has the edge over Trump. But the length of US election cycles leaves everyone craving those kinds of predictions. But reality check, there's a lot of campaigning left. It is a fresh start now that will quickly become the new norm. So what's it going to look like, feel like, and sound like? Joining me to discuss that is Elise Adamson, a former assistant US attorney, and Republican strategist John Feary. So lots of talk, John, about how Trump needs to start from scratch, a completely different opponent. What should the strategy be?
It's a completely different opponent, but it's really the same administration and the same philosophical fight between the parties. And I think what Trump has to focus on are those table issues, kitchen table issues like immigration, especially inflation, crime, the things that people really don't have a good feeling about with the Biden-Harris administration. He's going to focus a lot on personality because that's kind of his personality and the personality of Kamala Harris and her background. But he should be focusing on as the fundamentals as to why people want to change administrations and go back to him. And I think if you talk to campaign strategists in the Trump campaign, they're going to desperately try to keep the president talking about those three big points: immigration, inflation, and crime as the big things that reasons why they should fire Harris and hire Trump.
So John mentioned crime there, Elise. We know that Kamala Harris is really running on her career, her background as a prosecutor. She did that back in 2020 when she was running for the Democratic nomination. It didn't go very well there. Can you just kind of give us a sense of why it didn't work then and why it might work now?
Sure, absolutely. So 2020 was a very different time. COVID, we had, spikes in crime. I think the data supports now that crime spike is actually starting to decrease. But we also had what happened to George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And so most Democrats were looking for a more progressive way to tackle crime. And we were seeing a backlash to prosecutors. And as a former federal prosecutor, I can tell you I lived through that backlash. And so when Kamala Harris was running on a platform saying she was a former DA, former attorney general, there was some pushback. It said, well, you were incarcerating black and brown individuals. You weren't progressive enough. And so that was the landscape in 2020. I think that has changed and shifted here in 2024. And what's interesting is it's not just that Kamala is able to say, I am the best candidate to combat crime, because there is a perception in America right now that we have a crime epidemic, but also this new narrative we're seeing, which is prosecutor versus felon. So it is very sharply and cleanly drawing the contrast between herself and the former president as someone who has now been convicted of 34 felonies.
Right. So, John, with that in mind, the Republicans have always been seen, certainly called themselves the party of law and order. But now you have a prosecutor in charge of the Democrats and you have a convicted felon found guilty of 34 counts. Is the script going to flip there?
I think amongst Republicans, they felt it was a sham trial and a sham results and a sham conviction, and it was they don't really see that seriously. Question is, how do independent voters view it? I don't think that most independent voters are thinking about Trump being convicted. I think what they're thinking about is how they can pay their bills, and do they have increased crime in their own neighborhoods. The key to this election is making most voters, especially independent voters, feel that you're on their side and not on the political establishment side. And I do think that the conviction thing is something that Democrats are going to keep stressing. Every time that they've brought Donald Trump under a variety of different lawsuits and convictions, his poll numbers have actually increased, not decreased. If you look at his poll numbers right now, they're as high as they ever have been, despite the conviction. So I don't think that's going to be an effective strategy by the Democrats, but I agree with you, Alicia, is they're going to pursue it because that's what they've got.
And aside from Donald Trump, her kind of comfort zone, if you like, is when she is prosecuting. We've seen that with Brett Kavanaugh, we've seen that with Bill Barr. She is a very impressive questioner. So debates, we know they can go really badly, as we've seen in the last few weeks. There is pressure on Trump now to debate Harris. She says she's ready. Do you think she will, Elise? Do you think that is something that could be a real strong point for her against Trump?
I absolutely think it will be a strong point. And I mean, this is the second feature of this entire prosecutor versus felon narrative, because as a prosecutor, she's going to be prosecuting the case against Trump. And to John's point, it's not just, oh, Trump's been convicted of these things. It has to be a prosecution of his policy platforms. And I think she has proven from the instances you just cited and many others in her career that she's able to do that. And what makes an effective prosecutor? Being able to make points very simply so people can understand. That's what we do. We explain our theory of the case to a jury in a way that cross sections of society get it. And I think that Kamala is very successful at that. I think she's also good at rebuttal, right? That's another thing prosecutors have to be good at. We see that in debates all the time. A candidate will make a point. You need to be able to make a counterpoint to undermine what they've said. That was not present. That was what was lacking in the debate between the former president and Joe Biden back in June. Joe Biden was trying his best to stick to his talking points, was unable to just refute Donald Trump on the fundamentals. And I think that Kamala will be able to do that very effectively.
It is tough, though. Even if you're a very effective prosecutor, very effective in that moment, Donald Trump can fire hose falsehoods that are very hard to bat away, very hard to actually address each and every one of them when they come thick and fast.
That's absolutely right, but I don't think she needs to address every single one. I think, once again, that skills as a prosecutor, thinking quickly on your feet. How do you turn that narrative around and just go back to your fundamental policy places, and at the same time being able to kind of dismiss what he said? I think those are skills, and I think that Kamala is in a very good position to be able to answer some of the issues that Donald Trump will raise during the debate.
John, should Trump debate Harris?
It's a good question. I think there's some risk involved. I think the risk is that Trump can alienate people when he does these debates. We saw that in the first debate against Joe Biden, where he had COVID and just made a complete jerk out of himself and alienated a lot of voters, and I think that lost him the election. On the other hand, he was able to beat Hillary Clinton in debates pretty effectively. Even though Hillary had all the facts, that Trump was able to appeal because he has simple language that appeals to the voters. Kamala's not all that tested in debates. I mean, she didn't do that well in the Democratic debates. She did call Joe Biden a racist, but that wasn't her strongest point.
Things move very quickly, but it was very recently that there was an attempt on Donald Trump's life. And it's interesting, speaking to voters, the number of the Democrats that I spoke to the other day were saying that they were worried about Kamala Harris stepping into this moment, which feels very volatile. Elise, you arraigned some of the first insurrectionists on January 6th. Are you concerned about this being an increasingly violent campaign, especially in light of what happened to Donald Trump?
Concerned? Yeah, I think everybody should be concerned. We have seen an uptick in the potential for political violence. I think, the FBI is still doing an investigation into what the motives of the would-be assassin was. It doesn't look like that was politically motivated, but we have seen that it could possibly happen, right? So I think Americans do want unity. I think at the end of the day, in the media, it would make it seem like everybody wants to run out with pitchforks. I don't think that is the case. And I am an optimist. And I think that if both candidates are able to turn down the rhetoric and make this really about the fundamentals, about policy differences, then I think we can tamp down the likelihood that political violence will rear its ugly head. And I think that's what we need to do, because January 6th, I'm very sensitive about it. I was there, to your point. And so anyone that says it was just a protest or things that got a little out of control is simply not telling the truth. We came within, a few feet of an absolute disaster. I think democracy was threatened that day, and so we all have an obligation, including our political candidates, to protect against a repeat. And that's why, again, I call for just a tamping down of the rhetoric and making it about the issues instead of personalizing it and inflaming the passions of the base.
We actually spoke to a political scientist on the show, our previous show, who said that people listen to leaders, and that if leaders speak with less violent rhetoric, there will be less violence. And that's just not a throwaway thing, that's from research. Do you think Donald Trump will tone down the rhetoric? He seems to see it as a useful political tool to fire up his base.
First of all, this wasn't, he was the target of this assassination. So, and we don't know, first of all, the Secret Service needs to do a much better job. I mean, I saw a video of this potential assassin running all over the roof, and he should never have been put in that spot. So that the Secret Service has a lot of explaining to do as to why they let this guy in, and if it was an attempted political assassination, that's one thing. If it's a crazy person, that's another thing. But either way, the Secret Service needs to protect candidates of both sides. And yeah, rhetoric is always going to get heated, like Washington heat. That's all part of this. When they say that Donald Trump is going to end democracy if he gets elected, and then people on the left say he needs to be stopped, or he needs to be, we need to get rid of him. I mean, that's violent rhetoric. I mean, when Trump is not calling for the assassination of Kamala Harris, he wants to have debates with Kamala Harris. And I think ultimately, to your point, leaders do lead, and they do have to make sure they're not calling for the violent overthrow of the government. The same token, it's a political campaigns, and political campaigns always get heated, and there's always rhetoric on both sides, and that's all part of the thing. Like I said, the number one thing is the Secret Service needs to do its job, and they just did not do their job this time around.
Okay, and just very briefly from both of you, we heard from Anna Lichtman, who thinks that Kamala Harris has the edge over Trump. John, do you agree?
Well, I looked at that analysis of the 13 points. He makes an assumption that Kamala Harris is the incumbent. She's not the incumbent. She's a brand new person, and the voters have no idea who really she is. So my sense is that Lichtman needs to go back to the drawing board from his own 13 points and reassess.
Elise?
Listen, I think it might be a little too early to tell. What I can say is that Kamala has energized the Democratic base. She is obviously resonating with voters. And I think her message is now clear, and it might also resonate with those independents and those undecideds that she really needs to flip in her favor and to be able to prevail in this election. So I think she's got a chance, but I think it's still too early to call.
Elise Adamson, John Feary, thank you both so much for joining us. So Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have entered a sprint in this now transformed election. It looks like it will be a fiery campaign, to say the least, leaving us with plenty, almost too much, to talk about over the coming weeks. Do join us next time on Inside America.